everyone, hope you're having a good day. Today we're just going to be going over how to structure your speech and kind of organize all your ideas. My PowerPoint will work, thank you. Okay, so first we're just going to go over the introduction and then kind of how to go through your points that you're making, which support the main argument. And then we're going to go over how to conclude and wrap everything up. So let's start with the introduction. You're starting with some type of hook or an attention getter. So you want to like say something that grabs the audience attention, and you want to avoid cliches. So sometimes you'll see essays and like arguments just starts with like, have you ever, or they'll give like a story or something, which is a little bit corny or a quote. Those are kind of cliches, but if you use various types of anecdotes, anecdotes, that would be a good way to start your speech. For the background information, this is just information which would be necessary for your argument. So maybe it's not like a point that you're making that you're saying, oh, the prison system is causing poverty. That's kind of your argument. This would be kind of what the prison system is and what the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act does. Let's go into the relevance portion. And this is just explaining why it's significant and why people should care about it. And next, lastly, your thesis. So this is where you introduce the main points that you're making and then the order in which you're going to do them in. So it would be something like, I think that the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act is necessary because the current prison system causes massive poverty and is disproportionately affects Black Americans. So that causes poverty, racism advantage, and then you can go and explain them. So that's now the main points. So when you are explaining each of your kind of arguments for why you support a certain position, you want to first start with your topic sentence. So this kind of explains that argument that you're trying to make. So now you've said that prison causes poverty, or this current mass incarceration causes poverty, and now you want to say, how does it cause poverty? So you would say something like, through lowered incomes and educational outcomes, poverty impacts the incarcerated and their families. So now you have kind of an explanation for the process, and that's what you want to start your paragraph with. And next, you want to draw in different evidence. So to support your point, and this doesn't mean like reading a whole card. Instead, or now you won't even, you can use other pieces of evidence as well. But it means like paraphrasing and using short quotes, not reading long quotes from them. And then connect that to your thesis again, and you want to relate it to your overarching position. Why does it mean that we want to, for example, pass a Reverse Mass Incarceration Act, or why does it really impact everyone? So that's that last step. And then in between your points, you want to really transition the readers, or the audience rather. So an example of this could be something like, not only does the prison system cause poverty, it is also disproportionately affects minorities. So that kind of gives a organization so the reader or the audience knows when you're moving from point to point. And even when you're within your points, you could use transition words to kind of let the audience follow along. An example of this could be if you're building up a counterpoint, like some people say blah, blah, blah. However, that's kind of, I say blank, that's kind of a way to like separate what they're saying, what you're saying, so the audience knows what's happening. So lastly, you would use another transition and then say something about the conclusion. So trying to wrap everything up. The first thing you want to do is kind of restate your thesis, and you want to paraphrase it because you don't want to say the exact same sentence. It's pretty noticeable if you do that. But just summarize the main points again that you have made. And now you want to maybe take it one step further. And this could be, you don't have to do both these things that I've listed here, but one could be implications for policy or on society. So maybe this means that they should pass the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act, and it would really help society in XYZ ways, and that maybe restating kind of the significance of that you maybe have had in the introduction as well. And then, or you could say next steps, so maybe other possible solutions or other things that people should maybe consider or research or talk about, which is maybe not directly your question, but related to what you just talked about. So those are kind of just like the nuts and bolts of putting a speech together.
Awesome. Thanks, Sukriti. So next we're going to hear from Trinity, who's going to discuss the topic for the speech bowl, which will be prison abolition. This is an argument in the varsity evidence in both the marijuana affirmative and the mass incarceration affirmative. And the basic argument that Trinity is going to explain is whether or not we should reform prisons via political action like the government, or we should abolish prisons by eliminating them. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Trinity.
Hi everyone, so today I am going to be talking about prison abolition, as Clay just talked about, and we're going to be kind of going over some of the pieces of evidence that you'll see in the packet and kind of just analyzing what they really mean and what's important for you in your speech bowl speeches, and possibly later on if you end up using this within debate. But we're going to start with the Rodriguez in 2019 evidence from the packet that talks about how reform is not possible. So first, we're just going to start by talking about what the prison system is. So basically what the prison system is, when we reference that over and over throughout debates, is just all prisons across the United States. And we are going to talk about how they treat their prisoners, how they affect the overall community, and why they are bad and they need to be either reformed or in this case abolished. And so this piece of evidence makes the argument that reforming the prison system is not possible. And the reasons that it gives is that the prison system upholds many different forms of violence, and you can't reform any of them. You have to just completely rid of the entire system, the entire prison system across the United States. And so some of these forms of violence are racial, sexual, gender, and class. Specifically racial, when we're talking about racial violence within the prison system, we can see that minorities are disproportionately more likely to be imprisoned, and when they are in prisons, they can experience discrimination. For sexual violence, we see across the United States that people within prisons experience sexual violence. Then for gender, we see that there is discrimination based on gender for who is imprisoned and based on discrimination based on their gender, and that can affect how they're treated within those prisons. And then for class, we see that poorer people are a lot more likely to end up as prisoners and be stuck within the United States prison system. So again, this piece of evidence talks about how only abolition can solve all of these problems. And abolition just means that we're going to get rid of all prisons across the United States. So then our next piece of evidence from the packet is from Davis in 2003, and it talks about how we think about prisons and how we see prisons as something, as a place that we would never go. We see it as a place where like bad people or evil people go, but it could never affect us. And this creates problems because it allows us to ignore the problems that are actually facing these people within communities across the United States, because it's not really true that all prisoners are evil or bad people. It's that they face some sorts of like discrimination or problems within their community, kind of what we talked about earlier, how there's racial violence and gender violence and sexual violence within prisons. We see that all of these categories, like minorities, are disproportionately called like these evil or bad people and like placed in the prison system and become trapped. And so it's not necessarily that any of these people are evil or bad, but there's problems within the communities that need to be addressed by the United States government and by the people. And so saying the like ideology and the way that we think about prisons causes a problem. And so we need to eliminate prisons as a whole, because the way we think about it allows us to ignore bigger issues. And then the last piece of evidence that I looked at in the packet was from Mueller in 2020. And it basically talks about how we need to demand excellence within our society. And even if other people say that what we are demanding is extreme, we need to continue to push for these better systems so that we can actualize this improvement, so that we can make it possible. So even if people say that like abolishing all prisons isn't something that's possible and it's extreme, we still need to fight for that because of all of the forms of violence that the prison system upholds. And so that's basically what that piece of evidence is saying, is that we need to continue to fight for improvement and a better society. And that is all I've got for this piece of evidence.
All right, thanks, Trinity. So now that we kind of know how to structure speech, we know what prison abolition is, which is the topic for this next phase of the Speech Bowl. Now we're going to hear from Sophia, who is one of the judges in the Speech Bowl for the first phase. And based on her experience judging, she's going to have some do's and don'ts to help you get your speeches good to go for the next phase. So without further ado, Sophia, you can take it away.
Hi, everybody. So today we're specifically going to focus on sort of like the do's and don'ts of debate, but specifically about the speech bowl. And a lot of these are kind of do's and don'ts that you can use for the second round of the speech bowl, but you can also use a lot of these tips and tricks for future debate rounds. So the first one, and probably one of the most important ones, is that we want to create clash, and that's kind of the fun of debate. So even though we're in a little bit of a weird situation where you're giving both the affirmative and the negative speech, there's still a way that you can make sure that there's clash and have your arguments kind of go against each other. So one way we can do that is by being affirmative, you can kind of preempt what you think the negative is going to say. So you might say, even though you may think that doing the plan would undermine federalism, I actually think this, and you could give an example of that. And then as neg, of course, is a little bit easier to create clash, but always just make sure that you're also answering whatever the affirmative said in their first speech and not only reading the dissad. So though reading the disadvantage and talking about federalism is a good idea, you always want to make sure that you answer what the affirmative says, because answering the affirmative helps talk about why that the judge shouldn't vote that way. So the next thing, also another very important thing, is to not read word for word, specifically from the card, or if you have written up the speech in advance. Debate is all about public speaking, and as judges, we really want to see what kind of skills that you have and that you can show off. And so the speech bowl is a great opportunity to do that. Especially, it's even more impressive if you guys are able to use your own ideas and kind of share them with us. And so by doing that, we like to call it sort of thinking on your feet. So though preparing a speech is a great idea to do, you can prepare it with bullet points and writing just short little notes of what you think you might want to say versus reading word for word off of a piece of paper about your speech. And then also, in terms of the evidence, you don't want to read word for word from the evidence. And this is what's a little bit different about typical debate years. In a typical debate year or typical debate round, in your constructive, you would read word for word from the evidence, and that's great. But for the speech bowl, maybe for round 2, really consider not reading word for word off of your evidence, but talking more about your own ideas and kind of just leading into it. So the next thing that we kind of have relates to that, and that's about referring to your evidence. So just because I talked about earlier that you shouldn't read word for word off your evidence, you should still definitely use your evidence. Your evidence has a lot of really good warrants and a lot of really good statistics that are great for you to bring up and that support your argument. So if you do decide that you want to read word for word off of your evidence, a good idea would be maybe just to read one sentence or part of a statistic that you think is really important. And so always just make sure to quote and say who the author was and what the year was. But just keep in mind that your evidence is there as kind of a crutch, a good supporting arguments for you, but not something that you always have to read word for word. But definitely pull out what you think would be most important from the card that you can use in your speech. So the next one is also just as important as the content in your speech, but it's about how you communicate non-verbally. And especially with us being online and recording yourself for the speech bowl, these things are especially important, and also making sure that your judge is engaged into what you're saying. So one of the biggest things you can do is make eye contact. I know it's a little bit weird because it's not live and you're recording yourself. You can kind of make eye contact and look at the camera a little bit more. If you do have notes that you're reading off of, try looking down at your notes, and then you can look back up at the camera too. And the next thing is just you want to make sure that you're generally looking presentable and just ready to give a speech. So that means having a smile on your face, maybe changing out of your pajamas, giving your hair like a quick comb through, just to kind of make sure that you look credible and that you're excited to debate. And then the other thing is that you always want to make sure to keep your speech interesting, that you're changing your pitch, changing your tone, changing your facial expressions based off of what you're saying. Maybe you're saying a statistic that's really astounding and really shocking, and you can kind of like raise your eyebrows and get excited about that statistic because it's something that's really interesting. And then another thing I want to add that's also super important is that you always want to make sure that you're sort of showing, I like to say at least your shoulders. In an actual debate round, you always want to make sure you're standing. But since for the speech bowl, we're recording ourselves, sitting is definitely a good idea, especially to make sure that the sound quality comes out good. But try and just make sure you're at least showing your face because we want to see you guys smile. We want to see you guys speak. And so the last one, which sounds obvious, but it's so important, is to not forget that it's for fun. Debate is supposed to be a lot of fun. We really enjoy getting to kind of show off our knowledge, showing off how much you prepared for your speech. So we want to see that when you guys speak. So smile, really engage in the speech that you're giving. And just use debate as your voice. It's a great opportunity to share a personal experience or share a statistic that you know that you might not think other people know. So it's a great opportunity to really share whatever you want to share that's in related to the topic and kind of bring your own voice into the speech bowl.